It's about time to begin. Good evening. Hope everyone's had a good week. Does anyone by chance need a copy of the material? Remind you that there are still folders out on the table on the left if you do. And I pretty much tried to, again, put what is in the material you have on PowerPoint. Again, I did that because I didn't know if COVID would prevent us from being able to assemble. So in the event that there might have been the Facebook Live situation, I did that. And for those that watch, I think these are posted online anyway. They can have the material there on the PowerPoints, okay? All right, we're going to be starting in chapter 2 tonight. Remind you again, this will be after tonight. We won't be meeting next Sunday or next Wednesday night because of the gospel meeting. So it will be a while before we get back together. So I've tried to determine where would be a good breaking point in case we don't get through chapter 2. So we'll just see how it goes, okay? Let's bow our heads. I've asked Trevor to lead us in prayer. So as he leads us, let us bow.
Our great and gracious Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for the band of blessings there, Lord. We thank you for the opportunity, Lord, to gather in your house tonight and hear your word, Lord. Thank you for your with us as we study the book of Ecclesiastes, Lord. Be with our hearts and our minds, Lord, and help us pay attention, to your word, Lord, and learn what you want us to learn about this book, Lord. And give it, brother, as you teach it unto us, Lord, and help us to better understand, Lord. I pray that you would just be with the different ones on the roads traveling, be with the ones that's sick, and be with the ones that lost loved ones on the roads that are traveling, Lord. And thank you for everything you've done for us in our lives. And I pray that you help us do more for you soon. That those sick saved lost us for St. Christ without living. In Christ's name.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, chapter 2, the first verse is actually a continuation of a thought that began in verse 17 of chapter 1. So I want to begin with that verse and read verses 17 and 18 and then verse 1. And as you do that, I think you'll see that it really helps in understanding verses, just starting with reading verse 1. In chapter 17 and verse 1, chapter 1 and verse 17, I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I realize that this also is striving after wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief. And in increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility. A couple of things as we start tonight. This chapter can be divided into 3 sections. If you have a Bible that has subheadings, headings, and subheadings, the divisions are the first one ends at verse 11, where he's talking about the futility of pleasure and possessions. The second section is verses 12 through 17, where he's talking about that wisdom excels over folly, and it kindly explains that first section. And then the third section begins in verse 18, continues through the rest of the chapter, talking about the futility of labor. So verse 1 kind of, again, ties in with chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, but we need to understand a key word in this verse, verse 1 of chapter 2, is the word test. Another one, I don't have it highlighted, is the word pleasure. Test here, some Bibles may have prove, and that is used in chapter 1 and verse 17. So what the author is saying, I said to myself, and again, that's indicating he's reasoning within himself. He's letting us know this is what I'm thinking. But if you look at what he said, I set my mind in verse 17, I set my mind to know wisdom. That was my goal. And I set out to understand madness and folly. But I realized it was striving after the wind, because in much wisdom, you just get grief. And in increasing your knowledge, it just results in increasing pain. We talked about that. So he said, so I began to think, I said to myself, I'll test you with this, pleasure. The other things were futility. So I will set my mind to test you or prove yourself with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. But he says this too I found to be futility. And this will be repeated in this chapter. But the type of pleasure that he's talking about, is he talking about when he said, I set out to test or prove myself with pleasure? Was he having reference, I'm going to indulge in sin?
Doesn't necessarily fit the context.
No, the context does not support that at all. He's talking about, as he goes on to elaborate on it in the chapter, he's not referring to doing things that are evil. He just says, I was seeking to prove where I could get something other than futility. Good, wholesome pleasure. He mentioned about in verse 2, as we're going to see. You know, when you're engaged in pleasurous activities, what do you generally do? What's the emotion you express? Tears or laughter? When you're happy, barring, I know there can be tears of, you can cry when you're happy, but generally when we're engaged in something pleasurable, we smile, we laugh. That's our reaction because it's giving us pleasure. So this is what he's talking about here. So we need to understand that the context is not referring to sinful activity. Another thing to point out as we go on, what he's talking about here on down through verse 11, the author is not saying this only applies to me. Because remember, he repeatedly will say in the book of Ecclesiastes, as I looked and I observed my fellow man. So what's true of the author was true of everybody. He's talking about in this chapter what all humans are prone to do. Now, we need to pause and let me remind you of what we gleaned from from chapter 1. And I have it at the end of the class if we get to it, but in case we don't, it's kind of a review, but just or more so to bring out, I think, the key point in chapter 1. Why was our world that we live in, life under the sun, why was it subjected to futility? Do you remember that from chapter 1? What caused the ground to be cursed?
Was it sin?
Sin. Sin by disobedience. And so that's futility. We live in an environment of futility. Don't we all seek, aren't we all prone to try to escape that? Either generally with our own ingenuity. We try to find, we toy with pleasure, just like he's talking about. What are we seeking to escape? The misery that was caused by our sin. And there's no escape other than if the sin came through disobedience, then you wipe out the DIS. How do you fix it? That's the message in Ecclesiastes. And we need to remember that. He's not talking about anything. There's no futility in obeying God. There's pleasure in sin, but there's futility. You're not going to have, sin's pleasures, book of Hebrews, how long does it last? We had that lesson from Moses. You obey God, how long is it going to last? There is no end. So, this is what he's talking about here. So, but he says in verse 1, I reasoned, or I said to myself, I'll test myself with pleasure. And so, I'm going to enjoy life. I'm going to enjoy life. This was not what God told him. This was his own logic. And it's what we all tend to do. Rather than listen to God, what do we all have to do?
Learn the hard way.
Yep. We tell our children, that stove's hot, don't touch it. What will they do? Inevitably, they have to do just what we do as adults. The hot stove to us is trying to find happiness. We think that wealth and pleasure will give us lasting but it won't. If we had just heeded God's advice, we would be spared the pain that we go through. And that's really explained more fully as we go into this section. So, as we go on, he says, beginning in verse 2, I said of laughter, it is senseless. And remember, I said to myself, he's continuing that thought here. I said of laughter, it's senseless. Of pleasure, what does this accomplish? I explored with my mind how to refresh my body with wine. Notice, while my mind was guiding me wisely. Does this seem to be indicating that he says, I went out and got dog drunk? I refreshed my body with wine. What was the state of his mind? And he says this again. Look down in verse 9. My wisdom stood by me. It means the same thing. So, I said of laughter it's senseless, of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to refresh my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to seize foolishness until I could see what good there is for the sons of mankind to do under heaven for the few years of their lives. I had a couple of references to where this same thing is mentioned. I want us to notice the one in chapter 10 and verse 19. It kind of helps explain this verse here. In chapter 10 and verse 19, men prepare a meal for what reason? Sure, for enjoyment, and wine makes life merry. And money is the answer to everything. Now, we've not talked about the context. But if you looked at this chapter, what do we usually think about money? Will it make us happy? Everybody wants money. Why? We think that will bring us happiness. It will give us pleasure. It will give us reason to rejoice and be happy. But I said Solomon. I've tried to not purposefully say that, even though that's, I explained in the opening classes about. But the author, he talked about laughter. Is it good to laugh? Is that what your life should be centered around? Just find things to laugh over. That's the difference. So, that's verses 2 and 3. When he concluded in verse 3, when he said, I did this until I could see what good there is for the sons of mankind to do under heaven. That's really addressing what's man's duty, whole duty. God's already told us. What good should we be involved in while we're here on earth? Ecclesiastes 12 verses 13 and 14 states it. But what do we set out to do? Discover it. Find some other way of doing that. Circumventing the simple path that God had said to follow. So this is what he's beginning in this chapter as we move on. He says, this is what I did. This was my thinking. Now he focuses more so, he's turning from the pleasure to the wealth. He says, I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself, from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had slaves born at home. I also possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. I also amassed for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers, and the pleasures of the sons of mankind, many concubines. And then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not restrain my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor. And this was my reward for all my labor. So, I considered all of this work, all of my activities which my hands had done, and all the labor which I had exerted. And he says what he said in verse 1. Behold, what was it? There was no benefit. It was striving after the wind. Why was that the case?
I think something that we can get from this is the use of I, me, my, and mine. And we can harken back to Psalms 127, unless the Lord builds the house, he labors in vain to build it.
You know, it kind of, you wonder, does our thinking, is it really a case of we just don't trust God to say, you'll be happy if you do what I say? Is it like, God, I think you're deceiving me here? Is there, I mean, we have personal experiences. Is there joy in serving Jehovah? Are we not happy? Sure we are. We're most happy. And nothing can take that from us. People can lie about us. We can be put in prison. What does it not do? Take away what God has promised if we will side with Him. This is what he's talking about here. The author said, I did all of this. I withheld nothing. What was he seeking to do by doing that? When he said, I will prove myself. You know, sometimes, have you ever had the thought with yourself that if I had more than what I have, more material things, not just money, but I'll just basically make it an issue of money. If I had more money than what I currently do, I could do so much more good than what I'm presently doing. Have you ever had that thought? If I just had more earthly things, what could I be for God? Man, what could I do if I just had? This is what he's talking about. I got more. This is what I went after. We think we can handle wealth. When we look at other people and we see, man, they've just squandered it. They're wasteful, they're irresponsible. If I had had what I could have done with what they've got or what they had, and they wasted it. We all have this view of ourselves that we could handle it. This is what he said. So, buddy, I went after it, he said. I withheld nothing. Anything that I thought would give me pleasure, I went to the max. The logic is, I can handle this. That's our problem. God knows that. He says, that's not why you're here. That's not why you're here. So this is basically the reason that he says in verse 11. The same thing he said in verse 1. Trying to satisfy yourself with pleasure and possessions. It's just vanity. It's vanity. And he's going to give two reasons in the rest of the chapter as to why that's so. One of them, he says, for the wealthy man or the wise man who has knowledge and the pure idiot, do they have different fates? They meet the same fate. The other thing that he says in the latter part of the chapter, that he says this is futility as well. I mean, he says, he's going to say it's wiser to work than to just be lazy. But he says in the end, why work? You're going to meet the same fate as the lazy man. But then he says in the part of the chapter, he says the other thing too that makes working and being industrious and even worldly wise, responsible with worldly things, it's really futility too, because you can't take it with you, can you? And you're not in control of what they'll do with what you leave. They may be a squanderer. All that you've worked for, all that you leave your legacy to, you don't know but what they'll just waste it overnight. So why did you spend your life amassing and gathering and doing what I've done? This is the gist of chapter 2, okay? We need to be reminded, and I hope to do it in every class. What's God's wisdom? Wisdom is knowing the end at the beginning. What does the end of the book tell us? What's our duty? There's happiness. There's fulfillment. You'll take that with you. And we're going to see the difference in that as we go on. Any other questions or comments through verse 11? Beginning in verse 12, this begins the second section. He's contrasting wisdom and folly. So he's talked about pleasure, he's talked about wealth, and this is continuing that thought. So he said, so I turned to something else. I turned to consider wisdom, insanity, and foolishness. For what will the man do who will come after the king, except what's already been done? Remember chapter 1? There's nothing new under the sun. So he says, again, he says to himself, I gave thought to this, I turned to consider this. And remember, the wisdom here in Ecclesiastes is not godly wisdom, it's worldly wisdom. We can be very smart and successful in this life in physical matters. We can have we can be, Abraham was a wealthy man, wasn't he? Was he irresponsible? No, he wasn't. It's not that nobody can handle wealth. There were those who did. What about Job? He didn't lose his stuff by playing the lottery. So he was responsible. But so we're talking about worldly wisdom here, but it's not sinful wisdom. It's just we know how to be industrious and responsible. So we need to remember that, and that will be brought out more clearly before we get to the end of the chapter. So then I saw that wisdom surpasses foolishness, just like light surpasses or excels darkness. The wise person's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one and the same fate happens to both of them. Remember, he's describing a person's view of himself. I may think that I'm smart, that I could handle things that I may, in my mind, sense or reason that you're not handling this very well. It could be things ranging, a wide range of things. It could be the loss of a family member. It could be a divorce. It could be anything. And I might think I could handle that. You know, self-estimation is one thing. But the same fate, that word fate, is a key verse. What kind of fate is under consideration? I want us to look. I don't have it on in the paper material, but I've added chapter 6 and verse 6. Let's turn there. This really sheds some light on this section. Even if the other man, he's in this context, he's talking about a man that fathers, verse 3, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, however they may be, but his soul is not satisfied with good things, and he does not even have a proper burial, then I say it's better that he should have just been born dead. For it comes in futility, it goes into obscurity, and its name is covered in obscurity. It never sees the sun. This is talking about the one who, when there's a miscarriage, when an infant dies and never is born, that infant never sees the sun. It never knows anything. It's better off than the man who is not satisfied with good things. Even if the other man was to live 1,000 years twice, and does not enjoy good things, he goes to the same place that the miscarried baby goes to. So we're going to address that as we get to it. But he's talking, that's again a passage that brings out that the same fate awaits if a man is very shrewd, very smart, and wise, and another fellow is just the opposite. What's the fate? They both die. What's the incentive for being wise? This is what he's asking. Why not just be a fool? So there is benefit in being wise in this life, even though you go to the same place. But keep in mind the end of the book. The end of the book. You can be successful in this life. That can be an ambition, a goal. But keep in mind, you're going to stand before God in judgment for how you did with what you did. Okay? Questions? Comments? So the author asks in the next verse, So I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also happen to me. Why then have I been extremely wise? That's why he said, so that's why I said this is futility. Since there is no lasting remembrance of the wise along with the fool, and since in the coming days everything will soon be forgotten, how the wise and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was unhappy to me, because everything is futility, striving after the wind. This phrase that I hated life is expressed another way in verse 18. What does it say there? How does he express it? He hated what? My labors. His labors were having reference to all being wise, having wealth. When I come to the end of life under the sun, I'm going to be right where the guy who was just the opposite of me was. What benefit was there to do that? And the reality is, as it pertains to earthly possessions, Jesus put it best. If I was to gain the whole world, am I going to take it with me? It might give me pleasure and fulfillment while I'm here on earth. But there's a day of judgment coming. Why is that not what I should do with my life in and of itself? That is, be successful, be wealthy, enjoy pleasure. Why should I only do that and not recognize Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13? That's what we need to think about. And that's why he says here, I withheld nothing from my eyes, but I hated life. The author clearly knew, because he stated at the end of the book. Remember, he knows at the end of the book what he's not expressing now. He's taking us through his life, and he's taking us through what he has seen people do. He says it's been going on since Adam and Eve, and it's going on in our day and time. We seek to find meaning to life by doing everything except what God commanded of us. If we are happy doing that, what about when we stand before God in judgment? What's it going to get us? Knowing that makes us miserable until we do it. Anyone have any other questions or comments through that? That concludes the second section. We go to the third section now. Well, again, verse 17. Just a reminder, this is talking about worldly wisdom, not godly wisdom. You can't take wealth with you, even if you're a wise investor. What happens to it is beyond your control. What cannot wealth do? If you have a huge bank account, are you never going to be sick? So, section 3, the evaluation of human labor. So I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, because of what reason? I must leave it. I must leave it with the man who will come after me. Psalms chapter 39 and verse 6 states the same thing as this verse. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they're in turmoil. He heaps up wealth, but what doesn't he know? So the question that is not asked but implied in that, so why did you spend your life getting wealth? You think about it, you build something of value. If you could know that as soon as you die, it's going to be torn down, destroyed, how would you feel about your efforts?
Kind of a waste of time, would it be?
And this is what it is with all earthly endeavors. So as we read on, who knows whether the fellow that follows me, whether he will be wise or whether he'll be a fool? Yet he will have control over all the fruits of my labor, for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. Acting wisely in what way? It's not having reference to godly wisdom. I was smart enough to build an empire, but yet all the fruits of my labor, this is what's going to happen. Therefore, I completely despaired over all the fruits of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a person who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then gives his legacy to one who has not labored for it, what is it? Futility and evil. For what does a person get in all his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days, his activity is painful and irritating. Even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is futility. This is viewed strictly from the physical life point of view. But what will last? What will last beyond my life when I die? What kind of a life? You take what is said of Abel in Hebrews 11 verse 4. What about the fruits of Abel's labor? What did it say? Did it go to waste? What do you think? Abel, even after he was dead, his influence, his faith, his example, it continued to be productive. You can't destroy and waste Abel's efforts. Even if I disobey God, have I done any damage to Abel's labors? And that's the only thing that cannot be damaged. A life that is spent fearing God and obeying God. That will follow, that will live on. It doesn't come to an end. And when you stand before God in judgment, a life of faith, you're going to be rewarded. But we're talking about things other than that. This is what the author is focusing upon here. Verse 23. There's nothing better for a person than to eat and drink and show himself some good in his trouble. This too I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. Trouble here means, again, labor or work. So show himself some good in his labor. So there's nothing better for you to do what Abel did with your life. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment in life without? All of this, he says in verse 24. Eat and drink and show himself some good in his trouble. What do you think that means? Showing himself some good in his trouble, in his work. Whatever it is, he says it's from who? That being the case, who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? Him is referring to God. The point in those two verses is this. It is not within our power. Apart from God, it is not within our power to enjoy life. That's not inherent. If God had not did what he did, done all the prep work. You remember we talked in chapter 1, why did God make the seasons, the sun and the moon? Was it for our benefit or our harm? What benefit did God want what did He want us to do with that benefit? What's the end of the book say? God put us in an environment. Everything God made, didn't it say in Genesis 1, it was good? Everything God made was good. But everything He made before He made us, we were the last thing created, was with a view to give us an environment that we might recognize Him and serve Him. This is what God has done. So, yes, we can enjoy our life. We can enjoy physical things here in life as long as we understand who's made it possible. If I have a lot of possessions, can I say I broke my back getting what I've got? Now, I don't want nobody to waste it. Well, no. How did I get what I've got? It was God. God enabled me to do that. So, the good in verse 24, it's referring to what? Is it not referring to obedience? To obeying God? Eat, drink, and show himself some good in his trouble. The trouble is simply having reference to we're subjected to an environment of futility because we've sinned. What he's saying here is, in essence, what he's going to be saying at the end of the book. There is nothing better for me than for me to do what? Yes, I'm to prepare for judgment, but can I enjoy life here? Can I enjoy and have pleasure in physical things? Good, wholesome activity? Yes, understanding that who made it possible. If I am blessed with material things, should I hoard it? Or when there is opportunity that God presents to me, should I show mercy and be mindful of others? Because we know the tables could be turned. So verse 24, this good here mentioned in verse 24, it relates to the end of the book. It relates to the end of the book. Anything, questions or comments? Is it not make sense? Am I not connecting with you? Give me some feedback here.
It seems to make perfect sense. I mean, this whole chapter, it seems like it's been ripped out of the tabloids about, the lifestyles of the rich and the famous, the American dream. They've reached and they've scratched and they've dug their way to the top, and what happened to them? Fell apart. They committed suicide. Their families are broken. Because the main priority, God's been left out of the picture. I mean, that's when I read this chapter, that's what I see. I mean, it's just to rip out the tabloids of the great American, quote unquote, great American dream. Let's have it all.
There's that form of rich, the Hollywood version. And aren't we all rich in another sense? Is it easy with the naked eye to see the misery that they live in? That they're not happy? They may come across as, and they may pursue a lot of things from partying to whatever, notoriety. Brethren, are they happy? We don't have wealth of the nature that they do. But we have, remember what Paul told Timothy? What's great gain? Godliness with contentment is great gain. So, for a person who is good in God's sight, God has given wisdom, knowledge, and joy. While to the sinner, God has given him the task of gathering and collecting. For what reason? to give to the one who is good in God's sight. We talked about the word good back in verse 24. This too is futility and striving after the wind. In Psalms 105, we have a parallel passage here. This is what God did for Israel in Psalm 105. He brought forth his people with joy, his chosen ones with a joyful shout. He gave them the lands of the nations. Remember, God told the children of Israel, I'm giving you the land of Canaan. It's their land, but I'm taking it from them and I'm giving it to you. God, to the person who's good in his sight, this is what he does. So he gave them the lands of the nation that they might take possession of the fruits of other people's labors. Why did God do that? What does the next part that's underlined? Why did God bless Abraham's seed? What was he wanting them to do with that blessing? Fear God and keep his commandments. Isn't that what that says? God's blessed us. What does he want us to do? This passage in Luke 21, by your endurance you will gain your life. Now that doesn't apply to labor under the sun. That's a passage that has been misapplied to that, okay? All right. I want you to think of these three questions, if you get a chance to write these down. This was a review or something that I want us to do after each chapter. Kindly write in our notes a brief summary or the highlights of it. From chapter 1, what was it that made, we've talked about it tonight, what made our life under the sun become vanity? You'd answered it. How can that vanity be overcome? And why should we bother to do that? And there are some key passages, okay? Think of that. And we'll take up here with this, Lord's willing, in our next class, okay? Thank you.